You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. The Arab world experienced a profound shift in 1850, expanding Western missionary efforts, integration into the global capitalist economy, and the explosion of the print press saw new tensions arise of gender and the politicization of child rearing. But just how much did Arab politics and society change over the question of women and children? A new book, Labours of Love, explores this very question, and the author, Susanna Ferguson, joins us now. Susanna Ferguson is a historian of women, gender, and intellectual life in the Eastern Mediterranean and an assistant professor of Middle East Studies at Smith's College. Her research focuses on how questions about gender, sex, and science shaped political imaginaries in the 19th and 20th century Arab world. Her work has appeared in various scholarly journals, including Modern Intellectual History, the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and Middle East, and the Arab Studies Journal. She is a longtime host, former editor-in-chief, and now associate producer at the Ottoman History podcast, where she co-curates the series on women, gender, and sex in the Ottoman world. Ferguson's first book, Labours of Love, Gender, Capitalism, and Democracy in Modern Arab Thought, was published by Stanford University Press in September 2024. Susanna Ferguson, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you've, before we sort of get into the work that you have produced, which is about labours of love, gender, capitalism, and democracy in modern Arab thought, I wonder if we can sort of go back a little bit and just sort of explore what got you interested in just like studying the history of the Arab world more generally. Like, what drew you towards this?
Yeah, well, I now teach undergraduates in college, so I often tell them that, my own story with this region and this subject started as an undergraduate. I began really as a student of Arabic, of the Arabic language, which I fell in love with, and was lucky enough to spend time in many places across the Arab world studying, but especially in Damascus, Syria, in 2009, 2010. Where the sort of welcome that I received, the people that I met, and also the language learning I had the opportunity to do really kept me coming back. So I thought, what is a job, right? This is a question you ask when you're 22. What is a job that I can keep coming back and doing this kind of work? And so, being a professional historian of the Arab world was something that I, could begin to sort of think of as a dream at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting because you were in Damascus from 2009 to 2010, which is when I was also there studying, but we didn't know each other then.
Yeah, but it was a wonderful place to study Arabic and also to just learn how to be a person, in the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really feel that way because for me, what was interesting about Syria is that on the one hand, you had a developed society, developed country, but one that was very, very different to the one that you had left behind, if you're thinking about UK or the US. And it was in some ways very self-contained, and in other ways very much a part of a wider picture, a wider world. And so it was a really good place to sort of not just learn language, but learn about a new way of being.
Yeah, very much so. And, I think also the first city that you're on your own in for the first time is always going to make a mark. And so for me, that was Damascus. And, I feel grateful that obviously while I haven't been able to be back to Syria since 2011, I have had the opportunity to do research in other amazing regional cities, including Cairo and Beirut.
Yes, which actually sort of brings us to the topic which covers Cairo and Beirut, which is your new book. So I want to sort of start, if we can, right at the beginning with Tarbiyah. So, I mean, this is a term that sort of comes up and is quite pertinent to your study, to what you've produced, which is this term and how it changes over time. So could you perhaps, start by telling us what did this term originally mean? What does it mean in origin?
Yeah, so this is actually an old Arabic word, as some of our, as our Arabophone listeners may know, that refers to kind of, I would say, to the care of living things, the cultivation of living things. So in the pre-modern period, you find it sometimes in relation to the cultivation of non-human creatures. So, for example, Tarbiyat al-Hisan, the training of horses, or Tarbiyat al-Nahl, which means beekeeping, right? But it's also a key concept in the pre-modern Arabic pedagogical literature, where it refers to a particular kind of relationship of ethical cultivation usually between two men. So an older man and a younger man, a sheikh and a student, right? And it's a way of thinking about pedagogy and education that is just as much ethical as it is sort of content based, right? This is really about the formation of an ethical person. And then you find this particularly advanced in the kind of 10th, 11th century tradition of the refinement or cultivation of morals, or tahdib al-akhlaq, where this vision of tarbiyah as the kind of ethical making of a young man by an older man is really kind of spelled out most explicitly.
I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about for a moment, which is this idea that education is not purely to learn something technical, which you can use later on in life, which is tends to be how we approach education today. It's the idea of cultivating an ethical human being as they go throughout the world. And I think it's sort of interesting because tarbiyah, it is an ethical concept, but interestingly, as it evolves, it still is an ethical concept. It's just the efficacy changes, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that interests me about the concept is that I think that it carries with it, right? So I think of concepts along the lines proposed by Reinhard Koselleck as kind of sedimented, right? In the sense that it carries with it these older layers of sort of ethical cultivation, even into the 20th and 21st century, when it also takes on meanings that have to do with book learning, that have to do with, the angle of a desk chair in a modern school is referred to in a Tarbiyah manual. But it never loses, I think, its connection to the ethical and to this kind of broader social work of making a person, which I think maybe perhaps we don't think about as much as we should today.
Yeah, it's interesting because even when you go to sort of old universities, you will still sort of see slogans that were written on these universities from, let's say, 100 years ago, which will have things like, I mean, I think at American University in Beirut, I think I remember seeing one that says, so you may have life, or something grand like that. And, you compare that to, say, a modern university prospectus, which is nothing to do with your life. It's you can earn this much if you do languages.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it speaks to the fact that, the history of education and pedagogy in many parts of the world comes out of, deeply ethical, in many cases, religious projects of sort of the cultivation of others within particular traditions that I think remain with us even as they're no longer emphasized as you say, in many 21st century institutions. Or I think maybe I Can Be Stronger should stay with us, right? That this is still, even though we live in a kind of more secular world than people did at the American University of Beirut 150 years ago, we're still engaged in the project of making a person for the world that we want to inhabit collectively. And it's this vision that I think, theorists of Tarbiyah brought with them into the kind of 19th and 20th centuries.
Yes, and I was also thinking about the role of the humanities as well, because there is this huge debate within the humanities, which is, well, what is the purpose of it? And the sort of direction it's gone in the last 30 to 40 years is to think about the humanities as a kind of adjacent science in a way. So we're only as good as our studies that produce data and this sort of thing. But the older idea was, well, the humanities is an expansion of, in a way, a philosophy in the sense that you're trying to ask the question, how do I lead an ethical life? Which is, as Plato put it. But obviously, that's a shift that happens as well. But if we go back to Tarbiya, because this is quite pertinent as well, we sort of see in the middle of the 19th century, and we've sort of said 1850 is a rough date, a year, but obviously there's a little bit before it, there's a little bit after it. The region itself is in flux at this time. I mean, you had the invasion of the Levant by Mehmed Ali Pasha. You had the Ottoman reform efforts. You had all sorts of things going on, uh, and so on. So, how does sort of Tarbiyya evolve during this context, and why does it evolve?
Yeah, so the argument that I make in the book is that what happens to tarbiyya in this 19th century context is that it becomes the work of women in the home, right? That it moves, or it adds a new layer of sediment on top of this older genre of tahdib al-akhlaq, or sort of ethical cultivation of young men, and takes on really what I think is a kind of much more modern meaning, which has to do with what it is that women are doing in pregnancy and in early child rearing and early childhood education in the home. And this is notable, I think, because what it does is to make women and their child rearing labor essential to some of the central social questions of this kind of period of transformation and flux that you're describing, right? So this vision of women's ethical work and ethical labor becomes really important to how writers think about the big questions of their day. So this includes, what does it mean to be a civilized society? What does it mean to live together as a society, right? What are the possibilities and limitations of representative governance and wage work? And then also eventually, by the time you get to the 20th century, what are the possibilities for thinking beyond the kind of developmentalist time of colonialism? So this shift of tarbiyya into women's work also, I think, positions it at the center of all of these, big questions in modern social theory in the Arab world.
Yes, and these sort of shifts, I mean, they come about for a variety of different reasons, don't they? And I wonder if we could sort of reflect a little bit about, the specific causes of, why do ideas like this arise, and what problems were they actually trying to solve in the context that they were in? Because as you sort of argue in the book, obviously gender shifts completely and Tarbiyya becomes a more feminized concept. But at the same time, there are other things going on. And by
Mhm.
interrogating this concept of tarbiyya, we can have it as a window onto every other changes that are taking place in society.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important approach. Sometimes when I talk about tarbiyya to Anglophone audiences, they say things like, well, isn't this just Rousseau? Isn't this just Republican motherhood? Right? Isn't this just, in other words, an echo or a repeat, or what historian Omnei El-Shakri calls a bad copy of things that have already been thought about in, the US or England or France? And certainly translation is a big part of the story, and it's something that I talk about in the book. But as you said, my approach to this question of why so many people became so interested in the question of tarbiyya is really to ask, like, what did it do for them, right? Like, what did this understanding, this kind of capacious, ethical, and also embodied understanding of making a person as women's work, right? How did that help people to respond to some of the major questions they were facing? And so maybe I'll just give one example, which is, what I talk about in the first chapter of the book, which is the question of civilization, which, as many people will know, was a kind of watchword in the 19th century. It structured Ottoman imperial thinking about reform, particularly about what they thought they were doing in their provinces, right? And it also structured European colonial incursions into the Middle East, right? That places that are more civilized must sort of naturally you know invade or come to dominate places that are less civilized. And what that language did was to rewrite, in a language of sort of civilization and culture, a process that was actually, in my view, about domination and extraction, right? So it serves as a really important kind of cover for some of those processes. And what Tarbiyya shows us is that Arabic speakers saw this. I mean, they knew exactly what was going on here, right? And they contested it in its own terms. So they said, okay, so, you're going to come here and civilize us. Well, we're going to tell you that it's actually Arab women who need to do the work of civilizing, right, through tarbiyya. And that's going to follow like, an autochthonous process and an inner process in which Europeans don't need to play a role. And so, I think you can see there how the space of women's ethical labor in the home becomes the kind of place that people put, for example, their answers and also their anxieties about how to progress at a moment when European empires are kind of occupying this position of advancement and development and using that as an excuse to invade.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, when we start talking about so I think it's a good place to sort of start with this is the European expansionism. It didn't just start specifically with armies. We started hearing about missionaries, which is also drawing upon, other scholarship. We can think about Osama Makdessi's books, which talk about the way the Arab world liberalized in a funny kind of way through the sort of intervention of Protestant missionaries. This is another story similar to that, where you have in 1850s and so on, you start seeing the development of institutions from money from Western Christian institutes that are very interested in this idea of we're going to come and reform this society to make it as civilized as us. And this is part of the origin of some of this stuff, right?
Yeah, well, certainly, one of the things all of those missionaries had in common, not just Protestants, but also Jesuits and Orthodox and Lazarus and all kinds of folks, was that they were obsessed with educating girls, right? That this was the way that they thought they were going to make inroads into this less civilized society. And so, again, I think it's in some ways only natural that writers working in Arabic saw that and thought, well, we can educate our own girls, right? Like we actually have a well-developed ethical literature and pedagogical tradition. And we too can establish modern schools that will sort of equip girls and women for this work of making people that we're going to expect them to do in this moment. And indeed they did. I mean, you could see, for example, the Maqasid schools in Beirut, which were established in the 1880s by a group of sort of local Muslim notables who were very clear that, the education of girls is the key to the civilization of society and the creation of a harmonious social order. And so that's what we're going to be about.
So you also mentioned, because this is an important point, that this is also a study of the integration of one particular region into the global capitalist economy. Could you perhaps tell us, in what ways did the integration into the global capitalist economy transform the region, and why was this transformation necessary?
Necessary for the rise of Tarbiyya or
Necessary for the
necessary.
rise of both Tarbiyya as well as the integration of this place into the economy.
Yeah, so scholars have shown that the 19th century really brings, as you said, the integration of the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire into a kind of global capitalist economy on very unequal terms, right? So places like southern Turkey, what is now southern Turkey, the Lebanese coast, and Egypt become increasingly producers of raw materials and monocrop raw materials, so cotton and silk in particular, and also fruit in Mount Lebanon for export to an international market. Right. So this is part of the transformation that's shaping the world that people live in by the 1850s in places like Cairo and Beirut. And what this brings with it, in addition to massive sort of ecological and social transformation, is the emergence of the idea, if not yet the widespread reality, of wage work. Right. So the idea that instead of, a smallholder working on a kind of feudal estate, which was what many, say, Lebanese folks living in Ottoman Mount Lebanon had been doing prior to this time, right? You might be going to work in a filature, right, in a silk factory, or you might be losing access to land in Egypt because of the expansion of large-scale cotton plantations for export, and so you might be moving to the cities to find other kinds of work. Right. And so what I argue in the book is that part of the reason people become so interested in Tarbiyya, in this question of women's ethical childbearing, is because they're grappling with this question of like, what is alienable labor, right? Like, how come some work can be bought and sold and other work cannot? And the kinds of embodied feminized labor associated with childbearing, particularly breastfeeding, become a kind of limit case for what can and can't be sold, right? So again, Tarbiyya becomes a space for people to work out these essential questions that are, I think, global in scope about, what is a wage society and how do we operate within it?
Yeah, this is what some economic historians would call the rise of Homo economicus, the idea of the economics man, the man who thinks, because it's obviously 19th century, so they would say man rather than person, but the man who can think rationally about things in order to bring about, prosperity financially. And so some of these questions around Tarbiyya are also questions about boundaries, aren't they? They're questions about what are the aspects of society that we need to exist in order to be productive, but in of themselves don't produce much in terms of financial, produce much in terms of financial development in of themselves. But if they're not performed, we can't develop financially.
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought that up. I think there are two pieces to that story. And the first is, as you say, about this idea of Homo economicus, right? Or our kind of view of modern man. And I think it's essential actually that it is man and not woman as a kind of key figure in how we think about capitalist society, right? So a capitalist society is justified, is legitimated by the fact that people have a choice to sell their labor, right? That this is a freely made, right, in theory, choice to dispose of your alienable labor like a commodity as you see fit, right? But then the problem that Tarbiyya raises is that, of course, not all labor can be freely sort of withheld and given, right? So the labor of bearing and birthing a child is not as easily slotted into this kind of like, do you take the job or not? And what's more, what Tarbiyya shows us is that nobody, right, not even men, are born this kind of choosing, self-owning, autonomous subject who can legitimate a system by choosing to sell their labor, right? Because in fact, men, like everybody else, are born completely dependent on another human being, right? They must be fed, they must be born, they must be raised, they must be, in the words of the Tarbiyya theorist, they must be kind of ethically cultivated in ways that they do not choose before they ever enter into some kind of, free wage selling society. And this is a huge tension, I think, not just for people in the early 20th century Arab world, but in general, right? Like, what do we do with these relationships of fundamental human interdependence that sit at the kind of heart of both capitalist society and representative politics, as I argue in the book, right? And so what they did, or what we still do, I think, and what theorists of Tarbiyya were noticing, is that we use binary gender to separate those two domains, right? So men become the agents who can buy and sell labor at will, and the work of making men, which is unchosen and not autonomous, is separated from that sphere by assigning it to women.
Indeed, and I think also a part of what the family structures we're talking about as well is by the end of it, if we think about the 20th century as the kind of end of it, although arguably it isn't because it's still evolving, but for the purposes of the book, the end of it, you end up with something called the nuclear family, this idea of, I suppose it would be 2.4 children, husband, wife, children, and that's how you raise them. And this is from the history of the Arab world, a very different way of raising a family, isn't it? Like historically, before the 19th century, well, before the 20th century, actually, the idea is that child rearing is everyone's responsibility. It's everyone around you's responsibility. It's not just one person, although the mother is clearly the more important figure. It's not solely on her to raise the child. Would you say that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we know historically about family formation across the region prior to the 20th century is that there were many varieties. So you do see some research, especially in urban areas like Istanbul, of something kind of approximating a nuclear family model being the dominant form among, the sort of urban working and middle classes. And then, of course, among elite families, especially in Egypt, but also in Greater Syria and across the Ottoman world, you see these kind of joint households, right, which are multi-generational, include many domestic servants, and also until the 1870s, and indeed actually after, enslaved people, right? You see these they take the kind of architectural shape of a kind of complex around a central courtyard rather than a single family home, which doesn't become a kind of architectural model until the late 19th, early 20th century. So you're certainly seeing, I think what you're seeing is the rise of a new ideal of what a family should look like. And I want to emphasize that it didn't change things in practice as quickly as we might imagine, right? Still into the 1950s, you see elite families who are operating, in many different ways that are perhaps have more in common with the joint household than the nuclear family. But certainly you see the rise of a new ideal, which is the companionate marriage, right? The love marriage, and the nuclear family, which is just two generations, right? It's the two parents and the 2.4 kids, and they live by themselves in a house. And of course, what this means is a massive redistribution of domestic labor, right? So who is then doing that work of, raising kids, cooking, doing all of the social reproductive work that households require? And that's part of the new ideal that Tarbiyya tries to describe.
Indeed, indeed. And I want to sort of get into a bit more the development of the ideal. But before we sort of get there, just because it's a sort of interconnected question in a way, how do you think, for example, because I mean, as you're saying, as we sort of get to the 1950s and 60s, this is when the sort of ideal sort of becomes more of a reality across societies. Because I think I was thinking about this the other day based on something I was reading on Twitter, which is when you have this movement called the sort of the neo-trads online, neo-traditionalists online, who are these guys who sort of have this ideal of society where women don't work, they're at home all the time, and the man's out earning, and this is what they think of as traditional society. The problem, as this guy was pointing out, is historically women have always worked. It was only really a unique kind of weird blip in the 1950s and 60s where women had the option of not working, and a lot of them did go home, although there were still women out in factories. Historically, in the most poor regions, women go and work even after giving birth. They will have their child on their back and then they'll be working the fields. So, with that sort of in mind, how do you think the sort of women's sort of working relations changed over the period between, let's say, the 19th century until we sort of get into the middle of the 20th century?
Yeah, I think that's an essential point, which is that women have always worked, right? And you see that in the Arab region as well. I mean, certainly among the vast majority of the population of both Egypt and Syria in the 19th century is agricultural, right? They're doing agricultural work. Men, women, and children are in the fields, making ends meet, involved in household industries. And that's sort of the way that life has to be organized in order to make enough to live, especially on an increasingly peripheralized margin, right? So you're in a global economy where capital is not accumulating as quickly to your household in Mount Lebanon as it might be in London or Manchester, right? So in that context, women were always working. And of course, that remains, I think, remains the case into the mid 20th century, right? I think that so what we're really looking at is the development of a middle class ideal in which women are not performing wage work in the same way, right? They are still working in the sense that they are managing households, they are cleaning, they're washing bottles, they're child rearing, right? All of these new requirements of the child rearing literature, which we still have, right? Any contemporary parent is very familiar with, like, you got to wash the bottle at a certain temperature. You got to make sure that the food is healthy, right? Like, this is also work that we actually still think about, and it's still mostly not waged if it's being done in the context of a nuclear family without domestic labor. But so I guess the way I think about it is this: is that entry into the middle class culturally in this period came to require women not working outside the home. And that was a huge ask, right? For families for whom that labor was important to making ends meet. And it was also in some ways a huge loss for women's social relations, right? Because instead of being sort of every day involved in communities of labor, whether they were with other women in the home or in household industries or with, different genders in the fields, right? Suddenly you're at home alone while your partner's out to work. And you are now newly kind of required to do all of the domestic labor that is involved in raising a small human, right? And that I think the gap that the Tarbiyya literature was trying to fill in some ways is the absence of recourse to other women and older generations of women in figuring out how to raise a child.
Indeed, indeed. And something else I sort of want to ask you about here, which is we've sort of talked about how it sort of pulled them out of the economic set. Obviously they're involved economically, but just not in the direct way because they're being pulled out. But what does this do for example, social policing of women's behavior and sexuality and just general social relations? Do you feel this had a major impact on all of that? Did that change as a result of the adoption of women should be at home and stuff? And how did that impact the sort of, social policing in a way?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell from texts what the actual impact was on people's lives. I mean, I think then as now, people do all kinds of things that aren't what they're told they're supposed to be doing in texts. But what I did notice from the texts is maybe I'll say three things. The first is that they're incredibly critical of women's social relationships that don't happen through men, right? So gossip, especially obviously with female neighbors, becomes a huge problem in this literature. They're really trying to tell women, like, don't talk to women outside your own home because it's shameful. They're trying to intervene in cross-class female relationships. So, for example, women are being warned about not opening the door to like traveling saleswomen, who might be passing by and might be a source of gossip as well as, whatever thing they might be selling. And they're also trying to regulate women's relationships with middle class women's relationships with working class women in the home, right? The domestic servants who are actually essential to keeping this new kind of very fragile idea of a nuclear household that is also clean and healthy and whatnot alive. They're saying, you need to be very suspicious and careful of your domestic servants because their ethics are bad. They're going to steal stuff. They're going to do bad stuff. They're going to, and so I very much see this literature as kind of putting an oar in terms of women's homosocial relationships, both inside and outside of the home. And the other thing I would just say is that, the rise of this kind of didactic literature around child rearing is also, I think, both an admission of the limitation of male surveillance, right? That these are spaces that people are worried about because they can't actually tell. Men cannot tell what's going on, right? Like if a woman has bad thoughts while she's breastfeeding, like this is a big problem for the child, according to the Tarbiyya literature, but like men actually can't surveil that. But it's also about attempts to make that the case, right? And I think the modern schools that I was talking about earlier are a key example of that, right? They want to train women to be mothers in spaces that are adjudicated and administered by men.
Indeed, indeed. And because I think something to sort of bring in here when talking about the Tarbiyya literature, because we're going to get into a little bit about what that means in terms of child rearing in a second. But we sometimes, when we sort of have these sort of discussions about the modernization of the Arab world, we tend to talk a lot about, colonial forces. We talk a lot about outsiders, and often it's all a story of extraction from the region and then sort of importing things that are, not beneficial. But a lot of the people who shape the new gendered relations, including the new thoughts around motherhood, child rearing, are Arabs themselves, and many of them are women. We have rise of female press. So could you perhaps tell us about the input of the rise of things like female press, as well as women activists who are involved in popularizing some of these ideas?
Yeah, so, I originally came to this project in part because I wanted to think about what the history of Arab thought would look like if we looked at it from the perspective of the women's press, which, as you say, began to take shape in the 1880s. You have the publication of the first woman-edited journal in Arabic, Hind Naufal's Al-Fatet in 1892. And then, it really explodes so that before about 1940, you have almost 40 woman-edited journals being published in Arabic in Cairo and Beirut. There are also a few published in French. And ostensibly, there was also a bilingual Ottoman Turkish Arabic journal that I haven't found a copy of, but have heard tell. So this is a pretty serious domain of intellectual production that emerges in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's one where women really take the lead, right? So women are serving as editors. They're writing many of the articles, although they also published articles written by men. And they're kind of setting the agenda, I think, for what they think an emerging readership of women might want to hear about. And it's in this context that tarbiyya becomes a kind of subject of great interest, right? So all of these journals talk a lot about the question of how to raise a child. And the way that I read it is this is really one of the domains in which women writers try to use their kind of newly developing embodied authority as child rearers to make interventions into some of the major kind of theoretical and political debates that are going on in what historian Marilyn Booth calls the mainstream press, right? The sort of more well-known press and journals that are edited by men.
It's kind of interesting because in a funny kind of way, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about that book that was written on midwifery in Morocco, whose name has got out of my head, unfortunately, but one of the sort of things you sort of see there is that when it came to the issue of women's health, this is prior to, so let's say, modernity, let's say, or prior to the 19th century. If like there was where if it had to go to say a court case or something had to happen there, it was the authority of the midwife that was taken on board to testify about things to do with women's health, and it was just assumed if you're a woman, you know about women's health, thus you are the authority we should turn to. And we do sometimes think, with the modernization, we sort of lose that authority. We sort of see women losing that authority. What's interesting in your story is that in this sort of kind of way, which regardless of where this new idea of tarbiyya may have originated, it very much gets taken on by women, and so they are still the ones shaping it. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and tell us a little bit about some of the individuals that were working in this space.
Yeah, so one of the things I think is fascinating about the tarbiyya literature is that it offers us, I think, a really new and broad angle of vision on Arab women's intellectual production in this kind of formative period for Arab and indeed global modernity, right? So there's really quite excellent scholarship on the development of discourses about sort of women's rights in marriage and divorce, and also eventually suffrage, right? The campaign for women's right to vote. But what I think, this book tries to do is to bring to light a much broader, I think, group of women who came together around the importance of child rearing, right? And this is a difficult task because I'll admit that as a 21st century feminist, the idea of child rearing as a potential domain for sort of interesting feminist theorizing was like not that easy for me to get on board with, right? That's one of the limitations, I think, of my own particular feminist formation in the West at a particular time. But what I learned from reading these women is that indeed these questions of who does social reproductive labor and how is it valued in society, and what kinds of contradictions does it pose to the way that we organize both wage work and our political life, are actually quite potentially destabilizing, I think, to some of the systems that we live under in what I hope to be a productive way, right? And I see this as very much in line with the work of, Italian and Canadian feminists who argued for wages for housework in the 1970s, where, their call was really to say, if we actually had to pay wages for social reproductive labor, there would no longer be capital accumulation, right? This whole thing would fall apart. Now, the women that I'm reading in the Arab world aren't there yet, right? They're just living at the beginning of sort of a capitalist society. And they're not, I think, in general yet theorizing its downfall, but they're certainly making similar points about the kind of incoherence, the contradictoriness of the way that we think about gendered work. And I have to say, I became convinced that was really worth thinking about. So this kind of tendency brings together women intellectuals across the spectrum. So you move from people like Hannah Kourani, who's a late 19th century woman born outside of Beirut, Arab Protestant, who becomes a kind of like evangelist for complementarity, right? The idea that women and men have different spheres and they sort of have different forms of power, and we need to operate in that way to maintain a stable social order, right? So she looks quite conservative, small c, I think, from a contemporary point of view. But at her time, that idea, I think, was quite new. So her work about tarbiyah brings her into conversation with someone like Julia Dimashkieh, who was the editor of Beirut's kind of most prominent women's journal in the interwar period. It ran from 1921, I think, to 1927, called The New Woman. And Julia Dimashkieh is a suffragette. I mean, she thinks women are equal. She thinks women should vote. You know, she's out there calling for women's rights in government. But interestingly, she and someone like Hannah Kourani have a lot in common when they're thinking about this question of how to raise a child. And then the third figure that I'll just mention to show the kind of breadth of the conversation is someone like Labiba Ahmed, right, who is kind of thought of as a kind of fellow traveler of Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood in interwar Egypt, and runs a journal called The Woman's Awakening, based in Cairo, that I think is fairly read as kind of sympathetic to and aligned with an emerging Islamist project. And she too, right, is not only interested in the question of how to raise a child, but actually has a lot of the same things to say about it that people like Julia Dimashkieh and Hannah Kourani had to say. So it kind of brings to light this group of Arab women writers who, some of whom I think we haven't thought enough about because they don't seem feminist by contemporary terms, and certainly you haven't been thought about together.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as you're talking because I remember there was this one book on Iraq from the 1930s and education in Iraq. And the book was basically arguing that when sort of the Americans came to sort of visit the school, so the American educators came to Iraq to sort of see how education was forming in Iraq, they were not very impressed by what they saw. And one of the things that concerned them was the idea that boys and girls can be educated in the same classroom, because to their minds, and these were progressives of their day, men and women being educated together, they're very different. They have very different natures. This is the arguments they were putting forward, and they lambasted Iraq for doing this. And then Iraq sort of had to reform their own education systems again. Because it's kind of interesting when you think about it from the perspective of, well, this person wouldn't be seen as a feminist today, but what was being a feminist in the 30s was very different to what came after the war as well. So it's kind of interesting from that perspective. But thinking about these sorts of journals, and there's so I've got a few questions. One's around the sort of circulation of these sorts of women's journals, but also what was the interaction like with the audience? Was there like a situation where women readers could write in with questions, concerns, or complaints? What do we sort of know about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, just to the question of circulation, the answer is that unfortunately we don't really know. So I did find a few mentions of circulation numbers in the late 19th century period. And I think the one that I'm recalling was about 1,000 journals that had been printed and circulated. We do know that the entire world of the Arabic press is increasing in circulation through to the early 20th century. We also know that women's literacy is increasing. So we can imagine, I think, a kind of broadening sphere, but still a very small number of, journals that are circulated and printed. With that said, what we also know from the work of various historians is that printed material didn't simply circulate to single individuals, right? So a journal might be printed, but it would be distributed, for example, to a girls' school. Actually, in Egypt, we have evidence that the government was actually supporting the acquisition of journals, some of these women's journals, by girls' schools. And certainly there are accounts also in Greater Syria of, a journal might find its way into a school, into a household, into a group of friends, and then be circulated like far beyond the official circulation numbers. So I think, as I said, it's a small but growing constituency of readers. And I think the circulation numbers have to be thought of as a kind of baseline, but not the kind of ceiling of the kind of spaces that these were reaching.
And what about audience interaction with the journals themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. I find more of that in the male educated press, or the male edited press, excuse me. I'm trying to think if any of the journals I read had, I don't think that any of the ones that I looked at had explicit question and answer sections, but I can't say that for sure. But I do know that other press outlets at the time had those kind of interactive sections. And I guess I can also say that the rhetoric of the journals was very much a kind of intimate address to readers. So, Julia Dimeshkia, who I mentioned earlier, her Beirut-based journal in the interwar period, the front page column, which she wrote, was called "To the Daughters of My Country," right? And addressed them in a kind of intimate, almost motherly, kind of first-person way. And so I think there's definitely a kind of invocation of an intimate reading audience. And I also think, we have to think about the ways in which the women who were reading and circulating these journals in those small numbers in the early years, they probably knew each other, some of them. And so there certainly, I think, would have been audience and readership interaction beyond the page, in other words.
Yeah, and I was also wondering about whether, in terms of interaction, whether that changes the way a topic is discussed. So even if it's not a Q&A, but if you feel people are really responding to certain things and not others, whether that sort of changes the way you write about something. But I don't know whether we know much about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I see it as a rhetorical strategy too, right? It's one of the ways that the position of being a mother, it's one of the ways actually that tarbiyah moves from just being about the raising of individual children to actually being a kind of raising of people through the press, right? And this is part of the authority that I think women writers take on. And maybe I just had one other example that came to my mind, which is that, again, Julia Dimeshkia's journal would run contests where they would solicit essays from readers. And so that's one example, I think, of, kind of active back and forth between editors and their audiences.
That's very interesting. But even when we're talking about tarbiyah, and you mentioned the Cairo context with the thinking about it from the Muslim Brotherhood perspective, there was also another book which looked at tarbiyah in the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s, because of that incident where there was, I think it was a Swedish missionary school where a Muslim girl was beaten, and and the claim was that she didn't convert to Christianity, they beat her, and that triggered this entire panic in Cairo around the role of missionaries, and then onto the question of tarbiyah as well. Do you remember who wrote that book? Or
Yeah, I think you're thinking maybe of Beth Barron's work on, I can't remember the orphan scandal, I think is the name of the book. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it sort of finds resonance even there. I'm thinking about wider political movements. So before we sort of get on to the wider political movements and its influence, let's say, on democratization and so on, the issue of breastfeeding, how did that change and why did that become a controversy?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that because I think it's part of the book's argument that when we think about the history of like social thought, right, social theory, we need to be thinking about things like breastfeeding as key sites for, say, sort of the theoretization of things like capitalist society. So that's one of the perhaps more like polemical arguments that the book makes, which is basically that we can't have histories of capitalism that don't talk about reproductive labor. So breastfeeding is a really interesting, I think, space where women writers in particular, but also men, are grappling with what I was referring to earlier as the rise of a capitalist society, and particularly the idea, although not yet the widespread reality, of wage work. So from what we know, in the 17th and 18th century world of Greater Syria, breastfeeding was something that could be waged. So you see, for example, Judith Tucker has demonstrated that you see in marriage contracts from 18th century Palestine, frequently provisions that either that a wife will be due some kind of recompense if she breastfeeds a child, or that there will be provision made for a wet nurse, right? So that this is a kind of practice, particularly the practice of wet nursing, is a kind of, you know, agreed upon sort of thing that's possible to happen in the context of a marriage contract. By the late 19th century, in these women-edited journals that I was just talking about, the idea of paying somebody to breastfeed your child is anathema. They are on the warpath about this idea. They are, you know, reams and reams of paper about why this is a terrible idea and you cannot do this and breastfeeding has to be done only by the biological mother herself and all of this business. So the question is like, well, what's going on here, right? Why is this such a big deal? And I think there's certainly part of the story that has to do with kind of making distinctions, as I said earlier, between middle class households and working class women, right? So trying to discipline and denigrate the labor of working class women in the middle class home. But I think it's also a story about women writers in particular confronting this question of like, well, what is the difference between alienable and non-alienable labor, right? Why is it that some work can be paid for and other work cannot? And the answer they come to is that breastfeeding can't be paid for, right? You can't hire a wet nurse, I think for two reasons. The first is that it represents an unchosen connection between two bodies that you can't control, right? This isn't like I show up to work and then at the end of the day, I go home with my paycheck, right? This is the transfer of fluids, and therefore of, in their view, not just of nutrition and illnesses, but also of ethics, right? They are very clear that ethics are passed through breast milk. So this is not a kind of labor that is okay to have somebody who's not, you know, permanently invested in a child's future doing. And it's certainly not okay to have a working class woman doing it. But I think it also really raises these questions about like, well, what is the difference between paid work and unpaid work? And, you know, the first sentence of the book is a quote from Julia de Mesquita, the Beiruti women writer, which says something like, you know, the sweat that pours from a woman's brow when she bakes bread at home is the same sweat that we pay for at the laundry, right? So there are these really fundamental questions about like, well, what is this world where some kinds of work can be paid for and others can't? And how does that map onto our visions of sort of gendered bodies and their fluids? So I think that's part of the reason why breastfeeding becomes such a big issue.
Yes, and because it's also interesting to point out here, as you said, 18th century contracts, but also, as you point out in the book, you know, it's an established part of, let's say, the religious traditions in the area, Islamic traditions, Christian traditions, that breastfeeding by wet nurse is okay. It's something that's not particularly immoral to do.
Right.
But
And it even creates ties of right milk kinship among, you know, otherwise unrelated children, right? If you breastfeed from the same woman, you're referred to as milkkin, right? So you have a kind of familial relationship even beyond a kind of nuclear family model, which is another reason actually that I think it was so threatening, because it created kinship bonds that extended beyond the bourgeois nuclear family household.
yes, and I think although we've sort of said that, you know, it's also an internal story rather than an external story, such as colonization and so on. I can't help but thinking though that some of these concerns that are being raised are fears that we might just be civilized enough, but that civilization is much more fragile, and there's a feeling of fragility, and that if we don't correct some of these problems, it's just going to come tumbling down around us.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there's no avoiding that these are both in Egypt and in Greater Syria in the late Ottoman and early independence periods. These are societies which, you know, as I said earlier, have been incorporated into a world economy on an incredibly unequal basis, have suffered, you know, European invasions, military invasions and occupations. And I think there's a sense not just of fragility, but of urgency, right? Like we need to fix something very quickly, and we don't know exactly what it is that we have to fix, right? So we can look at, you know, the European countries that are sending these powerful armies to defeat us. And there's a lot of stuff going on, and we're not really sure which parts of it we have to do and which parts of it we don't have to do. So there's sort of a kind of urgent and experimental, I think, approach as well.
And so I want to sort of get quickly on to political thought? Because there's other thoughts that are happening around the time. You obviously have things like authoritarianism, but you also have democratization. Where do these sorts of debates tie into this?
Yeah, so the third word in the subtitle of the book, right, is gender, capitalism, and democracy in modern Arab thought. And so this was a point I really wanted to make, in part because I think that when I was in graduate school, there was some discussion, and there's still, I think, some discussion about why the Arab world is not, quote unquote, as democratic as other parts of the region. Certainly, if you look at the kind of quantitative measures that political scientists use to measure comparative democracy, the Arab world scores poorly. And I understand those measures are useful for other kinds of projects, but for me, I really wanted to ask the question of like, well, what was their encounter with democracy as part of a larger suite of political possibilities that included, questions about republicanism and representation, and also questions about constitutionalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Right, so the Ottoman Empire has its first constitution and its first parliament, representative elected parliament in 1876. It has another one in 1908. And Egypt also moves in kind of inchoate ways towards a more consultative and then eventually representative model, which culminates in the institution of a constitutional monarchy with a parliament in 1923 when they become independent from the British. So my question was really like, well, what were they thinking about in the context of all of these transformations, right? Rather than me coming and saying, well, this is an incomplete democracy because of whatever, right? Like what was their encounter with this set of ideas? And what I found, or at least what I argue in the book, is that one of the reasons child rearing became so important and feminized child rearing became so important is because it solved one of the key contradictions at the heart of democratic, representative democratic regimes all over the world, which is, as I mentioned before, the fact that men, in this case, male voters, are not born free and self-owning, right? They have to be ethically cultivated in childhood in an unchosen way before they can become, voters whose quote unquote free choices will legitimate the state. And that's an uncomfortable reality, right? If we live in a political system where the idea is that everybody's freely chosen vote somehow comes together to make government legitimate, well, nobody's vote is freely chosen because nobody is an autonomous, self-owning creature. We all came from somewhere. We all have an upbringing, So if we believe that, then the whole basis of sort of representative democratic politics becomes challenging. And so I think what Tarbiyya accomplished, again, was using this idea of binary gender to separate the work of making a person from the kind of, you could call it a fantasy, perhaps, an appealing one, but a fantasy nonetheless of, free self-owning, choice-making men going out to vote for a government.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it is a part of democratization and democracy that there's always going to be democracies demand a lot of people. That is the idea. No matter what kind of democracy you're in, a lot is demanded of you. If you're a citizen in a democracy, you're expected to keep up with all the key relevant bits of news so that you can vote on stuff. But also in every democracy, there are boundaries about where it ends, who can have it, who can't have it. It's a big part of the debate. I mean, we can think going all the way back to Athenian democracy, right? You had direct democracy, but you also had slavery. So the slaves did all the work that needed to be done so that the Athenians could have a democracy. So there's
Absolutely.
this is just a funny kind, in not a funny, but very direct kind of way, actually, a continuation of that idea of boundaries being necessary for democratization, which is part of the sort of philosophical contradictions in a way of maximized freedom and maximized slavery, as Plato put it.
Absolutely. And indeed, many of the writers that I read are making explicit comparisons between the status of women and the status of enslaved people, right? Which we may feel are appropriate or not in various ways, but they are actively pointing out that the boundaries, as you say, that the question of boundaries that has always been a feature of democratic life, are being drawn on gendered lines. And that's, of course, not unique to the Arab world, right? That is true of many early experiments in representative governance, including in the United States after 1776 or in France after 1789, right? So the question then that I think we have to ask is, why is it that modern democratic systems have universally had to start out by excluding women, right? And one answer, which, you know, I find compelling to a certain extent, that's been proposed by social theorists like Carol Pateman, right, is that there's just patriarchy, right? Patriarchy pre-exists. It's a feature, not a bug. And so, you know, when representative government came around, well, indeed, patriarchy was still there, and it meant that women were left out. And again, you know, to a certain extent, like I sort of find that possible. But as a historian, that doesn't fully, for me, answer the question of like, why, right? Like, even if patriarchy pre-existed, these experiments, like its durability has to be explained. Like, it doesn't just, things don't just continue to exist because they were there before. You know, we have to think about, why is it that gender has been one of the key lines for drawing, as you say, the boundary between the full citizen and not the full citizen? And the answer that I propose in the book is that it actually has to do with tarbiyah, right? It has to do with the way that these fundamental forms of labor that are required by democratic and capitalist societies are assigned to women. And they're assigned to women so that they can be swept under the rug, right? They can be separated from the spaces of politics and economic exchange, which then can presume the free and self-owning men that the women over there in this other domain made happen. And that, I think, is, for me, you know, a plausible explanation for why so many representative governments around the world have had so much trouble making women into full-fledged citizens, and continue to be unable, in my view, or incapable in many cases, of actually grappling with the cost and value of reproductive work.
So now the last question I want to ask you is, you know, maybe this is a hazard to ask a historian of this, but where do you see the question of gender in the Arab world going in the future, and what is happening now, do you think? What are the sort of dynamics that you see playing out now?
Yeah, well, I think I might want to answer that question in a broader perspective, right? So I'm currently based in the United States. I've spent a lot of time in and out of various places, particularly Cairo and Beirut, but I'm not. I think there are a lot of different directions that questions of gender and particularly feminist politics are taking in the region. But I can perhaps speak more clearly to my own context, which is that I think that the questions of the value and place of reproductive and care work in the society where I live now are like back on the table in a really strange way. And I would love to hear from folks who are based in other places if they're finding the same thing. But for example, I think President-elect Donald Trump, sorry to mention the T word, but it's in the air. But you know, his campaign made a bizarre promise that they would make assisted reproductive technology covered by federally mandated to be covered by insurance in the United States, right? And there have been various like strange sort of pro-natalist invocations by people on the right in American politics. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party is unable, I think, to think of any way to deal with the fact that people are paying, 70% of their income in daycare costs. Which I believe is true in the UK as well. The costs of daycare are incredibly high, right? The best they can do is sort of think, well, like maybe we could have a tax credit for kids that'll cover for like half a month of daycare, right? So I think the inability of politicians across the spectrum or across the mainstream spectrum in my own society has convinced me that these questions of like who pays for breastfeeding like are not gone, right? And we may indeed have a lot to learn from reading theorists of reproduction and social reproduction from across the globe, which includes Arab theorists of tarbiyah. And maybe I'll just say one last thing, which is that in my own context, I've been amazed by how challenging it is to get rid of the idea of binary gender, right? People are so committed to this idea that there is one man and one woman, and those are the two types, and that's it, despite all of the evidence that we have to the contrary. And this comes up when people talk about trans women athletes. This comes up when people are worried about, who's using what bathroom. I mean, just these really, what seem like insane flourishes in contemporary politics. But what reading theorists of Tarbiyya has helped me to see is that this commitment to binary gender is not just like some kind of epiphenomenal phenomenon, right? The commitment to binary gender is baked into how we manage to live the contradictions of democracy and capitalism. And that's why it's, in some ways, I think why it's so hard to abandon, but also possibly, potentially quite transformative to do so.
Susanna Ferguson, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thanks very much for having me.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you missed this one and would like to catch up, or would you like to watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.